AOC's A Message from the Future is a great short film and a great concept for a film. It's one thing to imagine the future and make plans for it, but imagining yourself decades into the future and looking back on what happened because of our actions or inaction can get you thinking about the issue in new ways. On the one hand, with respect to the climate crisis, if we do little or nothing, then we might rightly shudder at what the future holds. On the other hand, we can imagine a future in which we full-on acknowledged and faced the climate crisis in 2020, rather than continuing to deny its reality and delay action on it. Moreover, we can imagine a future where we took up the challenge of acting on this knowledge in the opening months of 2020. In so doing, we can not only begin to imagine how to get there from here, one step at a time, but also underscore that it is in fact possible. This can be both heartening as well as inspire us to action, even in the midst of an extraordinary crisis that threatens the very future of our species. Incidentally, nothing in AOC's imagined future is at all implausible. As the film notes early on with respect to the Great Green New Deal, AOC, we knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it. But people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got there. Similarly, the film ends by noting that, quote, the big first step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see. This is, of course, a wonderful closing line, as we, as a culture, can be whatever we have the courage to see. In other words, within reason, whatever we can imagine for ourselves and our culture in the future, we can bring about, starting today. Note that AOC believes that we had all the technology to do it in 2020. In other words, what is needed is to make sweeping cultural changes, as well as to apply the technology we already have, such as installing more solar panels, wind turbines, and so forth. Sure, newer and better technology can certainly help, but there is no need to wait for it, as we can begin without it now. So I started these lectures by reflecting on what my generation knew about the future, what we knew would likely happen if we did not act, and act quickly and decisively. Well, even if you didn't watch those lectures, you know that we did little or nothing. Even though scientists were making pretty dire predictions about the year 2000, let alone 2020, as 2020 was 40 years in the future when I was 20 years old, it seemed incredibly far off. Conversely, given the predictions that were made when I was a child and a teenager, that's throughout the 1960s and 70s, this future seemed frighteningly close, somewhat paradoxically, and real. In my mid-teens, I remember reading books like Diet for a Small Planet and the Whole Earth Catalog and being really frightened for the future. This course began on the opening days of a new decade. Scientists are not only in agreement that our global climate is changing, but also in agreement that we need to act now, in this decade. True, we should have acted 40 or even 50 years ago, but there is still time to act if we do it quickly and decisively, now, in the decade that we just entered. In a way, AOC has thrown down the gauntlet for each of us. Can you imagine, given the current reality of the climate crisis, a future in which you would like to live? Equally importantly, can you imagine how to get to that future from here? I would like to offer the YouTube comment space as an opportunity for you to do just that. The title of this course is, of course, The Climate Crisis, What It Is, and What Each of Us Can Do About It. Well, imagine yourself 40 years in the future. For many of you, this would mean that you will be about my age now, 60. Imagine 40 years in the future, reflecting back on the climate crisis, what it was, and what each of us did about it. In imagining what it was, I am not suggesting that the crisis will be passed by 2060. Rather, I'm inviting you to reflect on the nature of the crisis, what it is now in 2020. In other words, what we knew in 2020 could happen if we failed to act. For example, our first reading for the course, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, mentions quite a few things. Mainly, though, I'm inviting you to imagine what each of us did about it. If you prefer, you could just write on this, what we did. This is very much like what AOC did in A Message from Tomorrow. In fact, what I am suggesting is that, like AOC, you write a message from the future, in this case 2060 to today, 2020. Feel free to go about this in any way that you like. For example, you could take AOC's lead and write about what we, as a country, did. You could, like AOC, talk about important milestones such as, I'll quote her here, when the Democrats took back the Senate and the White House in 2020 and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. Well, you could also talk about what we did as a species rather than just one country. Alternately, you could zoom in on yourself and talk about the actions that you took, from changing your personal habits to climate activism to political actions to communicating to others. Or zoom out a little and reflect on what you and your friends, perhaps your generation, collectively did. In some sense, this is sort of like, I would imagine it like, a New Year's resolution, insofar as it encourages us to imagine life as we would like it rather than how it is. Moreover, it expresses a well-defined personal commitment to try to make this happen. As with a New Year's resolution, things may not turn out the way that we hope. For example, Democrats may not, as AOC hopes, take back the White House in 2020. Still, the important thing is that she has resolved to do everything that she can to try to make this happen. The question is, what will you resolve to try to make happen? The operative word here is try. It's perfectly fine to be realistic, to acknowledge, for example, that things did not go according to plan, or took longer than expected. Perhaps you tried to immediately begin eating a plant-based diet, but it took 3 years to finally get the hang of it. It's also okay to be pessimistic, if that's how you really feel. Perhaps the 2020s was a decade that we tried and failed to pass the Green New Deal and similar legislation. Perhaps the American dream of bigger houses, more cars, and mountains of stuff not only proved unstoppable, but spread like a virus to the rest of the world as we quickly consumed the planet in the next 40 years, or at least destroyed its ability to sustain our species. Regarding format, it's entirely up to you. So here are a few possibilities. As with AOC's example, this could be a general statement sent out to everyone. If you're planning to have a child or children, you could write a letter to them. You could also write a letter to yourself, sort of a time capsule to be opened in 40 years. You could even imagine yourself as a teacher in front of more than 800 students confessing that your generation fully knew that radical environmental action was imperative when you were 20, but instead your generation chose to do nothing. If you like writing on sci-fi in particular, great, feel free to go a little crazy here. If you do not think of yourself as a writer, that's okay too. As with all the comments in this class, even though it's an English course, I am more interested in what you have to say than if you make a grammatical mistake or two. Since this one comment is taking the place of 3 that we ordinarily have every week, it should be approximately 3 times the length of an average comment, and accordingly it will be worth the same as 3 comments with respect to the course grade. And 2, since there is no reading or film assignment, please take the time that you would have devoted to reading and watching to thinking about the future. If you need a little inspiration, I suggest rewatching AOC's A Message from the Future. In addition, let me end with a description of that video provided by the filmmakers, as it nicely lays out what AOC set out to do. This is the filmmaker speaking. What if we actually pulled off the Green New Deal? What would the future look like? Said a couple decades from now, the film is a flat-out rejection of the idea that a dystopian future is a foregone conclusion. Instead, it offers a thought experiment. What if we decided not to drive off the climate cliff? What if we decided to radically change course and save both our habitat and ourselves? We realize that the biggest obstacle of the kind of transformation that the Green New Deal envisions is overcoming the skepticism that humanity could ever pull something off on this scale with this speed. That's the message we've been hearing from the Sirius Center, that it's too big, too ambitious, that our Twitter-addicted brains are incapable of it. This film flips the script. It's about how, in the nick of time, a critical mass of humanity in the largest economy on Earth came to believe that we actually were worth saving. Because, as AOC notes in the film, our future has not yet been written, and we can be whatever we have the courage to see. Incidentally, just in case YouTube is not around in 20 years, my goal is to also upload these comments to the Internet Archive in the hope that you can, if you are interested to look back on the future from the future in 2020 and 2060, look at what you've written.